All right, I think we can start and wait for others to join in. I wanted to do a brief introduction of the Hague program and the monthly book seminar series before we started, but I'm going to leave that towards the end so that, as more people join in, they also get a flavor of the broad subjects that have been part of the monthly book seminar series. But before all that, welcome to the final book discussion of the monthly seminar series organized by the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity at Leiden University. I am Arun Sukumar. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Hague Program at Leiden, and next month I will be moving to a slightly different role as assistant professor, but of course continue to be very much engaged with the Hague Program. This book discussion is on the title of our book that I have had the privilege and honor to co-edit with Ian Johnstone and Joel Trachtman is the product of a symposium that was organized at Fletcher under the banner of the Center for International Law and Governance in 2021. It coincided, I think, with the final stages of the UNGG, resulting in several of the UNGG experts turning up and contributing to the seminar, making the dialogue itself, a genuinely multi-stakeholder discussion. And the book is published by Elgar. It was published late this summer and features 4 thematic chapters, in addition to the introduction and conclusion, 4 thematic chapters approaching multi-stakeholder cyber diplomacy, a ubiquitous phenomenon that, and I'm very proud to say that this is, I think, the first book-length discussion on the topic, and it is ubiquitous as a phenomenon and definitely in need of greater theoretical engagement and policy analysis. The 4 thematic chapters engage with MCD, multi-stakeholder cyber diplomacy, from perspectives of international law, international relations, internet governance, and technology policy, and geopolitics more broadly, and we have country-specific chapters that review, comparatively the positions of various influential state actors towards multi-stakeholder diplomacy. And how we are going to do this today is I'm going to hand it over to my co-editors, Ian Johnstone, who's a professor of international law at the Fletcher School and whose latest book, apart from this, is Talking International Law, Legal Argumentation Outside the Courtroom, co-edited volume that he produced with Stephen Radner. Joel Trachtman is also a professor of international law at the Fletcher School and the Henry Breaker Professor of Commercial Law at the school, who is most recently a founder of the Remaking Trade Project, a project to reform the WTO and multilateral trading regime to better align it with a commitment to a sustainable future, including access to clean energy. Itself a multi-stakeholder and interdisciplinary project that some of you in the room may be interested in. After Ian and Joel introduce the book, I would like to hand it over to Josephine Wolff, Jinhe Liu, and Chris Painter in that order. Josephine is an associate professor of cybersecurity policy at the Fletcher School. Her latest book herself is Cyber Insurance Policy, Rethinking Risk in an Age of Ransomware, Computer Fraud, Data Breaches, and Cyber Attacks, from MIT Press. Jinhe Liu is an assistant professor of communications and journalism at Peking University. A very warm welcome to you, notwithstanding the time differences. I know that it is late in Beijing. And finally, we have Chris Painter, who will talk about his experience and the chapter, of course, documenting US approaches to cyber diplomacy. Chris is a veteran and celebrated cyber diplomat who has, among other things, been awarded the Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese government. But more importantly to us lesser mortals, he has been a commissioner of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and is currently the president of the GFCE Forum, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. So that's about the book. I will come back later and towards the end of the seminar to talk a bit more about the book seminar series, capping what has happened so far this year and looking forward to next year. But that comes at the end. Without any further ado, Ian, over to you. You are on mute.
Good start. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We have our book authors, a good number of book authors here, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. I'm going to say a bit more about the book as a whole, and then a little bit about my chapter, and then I'll turn it over to our co-editor, Joel Trachtman. So as the title suggests, the book is really about three things. It's about cybersecurity, it's about regime building, and it's about multi-stakeholder diplomacy. Cybersecurity, not all internet governance, not even all cybersecurity, but with a focus on certain types of cyber operations. And so the central focus is on operations that either amount to the use of force or are in some ways politically motivated. So we're not really talking about cyber crime, or we're not talking about digital privacy and whatnot, but certain kinds of cyber attacks, so to speak. Regime building, it's a case study in how international legal and institutional regimes are built, what the process is, who are the actors, what are the factors that drive it forward or hold it back. And third, it's about multi-stakeholder diplomacy. Okay, what's the role of non-state and, to an extent, sub-state actors in the regime building process? How do they participate, and how do they exercise influence? So all of that in one relatively snappy book of 250 or so pages. There are 5 central questions that run through the book in fairly simplistic form. First of all, what is the attitude of the major cyber powers towards multi-stakeholder diplomacy? Second, what can we learn from past and ongoing cybersecurity multi-stakeholder initiatives? Third, what can we learn from multi-stakeholder regimes and institutions in other domains like health and labor and whatnot? Fourth, what are the most promising institutional arrangements for implementing cybersecurity norms? So not just making the norms, but implementing them. And fourth, how do the domestic approaches, the domestic politics in the major cyber powers towards multi-stakeholder engagement affect their diplomacy? So I'll leave it to Joel to say a bit more about the content of the book and the structure of the book, but just 1 minute on my chapter, which is not about the making of new norms per se, but about the implementation of those that we already have. But my starting point is that the line between making new norms and implementing existing norms is blurry, not only in this field, but in many fields of international law. And sort of to put it in terms that I think international lawyers will be familiar with, the interpretation and application of international norms, imprecise norms, can lead to their hardening into binding law. So what I do is in my chapter, I look at the implementation mechanisms that are being used or can be used for implementing cybersecurity norms. And I cluster them into 5 groups. I won't go into all the details right here, but the sort of driving spirit underlying the chapter is that this regime has been and probably will continue to be built piecemeal, incrementally. Not adopting a treaty and building an institution in one fell swoop, but sort of adding incrementally to what we've already got. And in the process, not only improving compliance with the norms we've got, but perhaps developing and adding precision and greater bite to the norms that we've got. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joel Trachtman. Joel?
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Arun. And thanks to everyone for being here to discuss this critical question of how do we do diplomacy? And diplomacy is an old word, but the question here is how do people in different countries cooperate in this sector? And as Arun alluded to in his introductory remarks, this type of diplomacy, this type of cooperation, I think exists in many fields, and it's a result of the complexification of the greater complexity of all of the different areas of international cooperation. And as Arun suggested, I've been experiencing this in this area of trade and sustainable development that I've been working in since finishing this work. And I think it does apply in just about every area of international cooperation. And so this book is an opportunity to learn in this context, which is a distinct context with its own characteristics, how multi-stakeholder diplomacy might work, how it might make rules, and how those rules, as Ian has discussed, can be applied. And this is an example. Arun and Ian and I designed this book. It was not a conference volume where we simply put together a bunch of chapters, but it was orchestrated research where we tried to design something that would reveal something about this area of multi-stakeholder diplomacy in cybersecurity. So we have Arun's chapter on geopolitics, and as we look at current wars, we can see that geopolitics have a tremendous effect in this area. We have Josephine Wolff's chapter really describing the different efforts in this particular area, and they're different, and they integrate together in I think surprising ways to tell us how multi-stakeholder diplomacy works. My own chapter, which I'll say a bit more in a moment, looks at some prior areas of multi-stakeholder diplomacy and what we can learn about those areas that might have application in other areas. And then Ian's chapter is about the design of international institutions for making and most importantly for applying these rules. So my chapter starts with the question about legitimacy. What do we mean when we talk about stakeholders? Who holds a stake? Who gets a stake in these decision-making processes? And I think the answer to that has to do with who has power, who has resources in these areas, and who has interests and concerns in these areas. And part of the equation is also who has expertise. And one of the things that I learned in developing this book is how much expertise in this area and how much power in this area is held in the private sector. So it's a diplomacy that has multiple modes and multiple vectors. It's a kind of new diplomacy. It's different from the Fletcher School where Ian and I and Josephine teach, and where Arun studied, is a place that was formed in 1933 for the old diplomacy, and we've been trying to kind of develop and learn about a new diplomacy with fragmented regime complexes that intersect in difficult ways and with different countries. And one of the things that we'll hear about as we hear about the chapters is how the private sector, the so-called private sector, is different in different countries and has different constraints and different powers. And then there are lots of design questions like transparency, the concern, which is a very real concern about industry capture, where you have industries that are interested in their own profits and not necessarily in the full range of social interests that the state will represent. So how do we design multi-stakeholder diplomacy to deal with that? How do we make decisions? How do we deploy power? What is the scope of legislative authority? What is the scope of authority to adjudicate or otherwise apply? And in my chapter, I looked at ICANN, at the International Telecommunications Union, the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the International Standards Organization, the Codex Alimentarius, which does similar things in the food safety area to the International Standards Organization, and the tripartite structured International Labor Organization. So that was a chance to just see how those differences in power, in stakes, might affect the structure of diplomacy. It's looking at the world and trying to draw some inferences as to how design might be done in other areas. So sorry to be brief, but now I'll pass it back to Arun to call on the other speakers.
Thanks, Joel and Ian. If I may now invite Josephine to talk about her chapter, which I forgot to introduce, which surveys the landscape and the evolution of multi-stakeholder initiatives in this domain. Josephine.
Thank you so much, Arun. I'm so thrilled to be here. I was so excited to be part of this project, in large part because I don't have a really deep background in multi-stakeholder diplomacy. I'm somebody who trained as a computer scientist, and when you train as a computer scientist and you do sort of internet policy and cybersecurity stuff, there's really one organization that informs everything you learn and know about multi-stakeholderism, and it's ICANN. Because it's been ICANN's sort of rallying cry for so long. We are the multi-stakeholder organization. We do the multi-stakeholder governance. So for me, this was a really incredible opportunity to learn from colleagues who are much more steeped in this space, who have experience with all the other kinds of regimes that Joel was just talking about, and to understand that this is not actually something that ICANN invented or something that the internet created for itself. My chapter is really focused on trying to understand what are the multi-stakeholder components of a bunch of the different norms development processes that we've seen in this space so far. So I look at the GGE and the OEWG, but I also look at entities like the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and the OSCE, the folks who developed the Tallinn Manual, trying to kind of get a sense of a bunch of different initiatives in this space that have been sponsored and structured in different ways. I should also mention the Paris Call and the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, sort of the industry-led initiatives to some extent in this area. And what I was trying to do was, first of all, kind of map out what are the multi-stakeholder components? What do they look like in each of these different forums? I mean, I'm not going to talk about that in a lot of detail right now because I've been asked to be brief. But what I do want to just mention quickly are sort of what some of my high-level takeaways were from doing this review of how all of these different entities operated and tried to incorporate government and tried to incorporate private sector voices, tried to incorporate civil society. And I think sort of there's, to be a little bit overly simplistic, I think a positive takeaway and a slightly more negative one that I had from doing this survey. The positive takeaway, the thing that I was sort of pleasantly a little bit surprised by, is that there have been a real diversity of multi-stakeholder models across these different processes. And sort of starting with the GGE and looking at a really kind of state-centric model for norms development, but really ranging across industry-led initiatives, things like the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, looking at kind of more academic and civil society run initiatives, things like the Global Commission, understanding some of the entities where you have a group of like-minded states or individuals trying to put together a proposal like the Tallinn Manual. I think we've seen to a really remarkable extent people experimenting with a number of different ways for sort of trying to develop norms, and in particular, and of interest to me, trying to kind of develop really technical norms to think about kind of how do we protect the core protocols and infrastructure at the heart of the internet, and are there ways to engage technical stakeholders more directly and make sure that their voices are part of this process. And that I thought was really sort of hopeful and inspiring to see that kind of as people have observed, especially the GGE process, and criticized it at times and said, we should be trying some of these other things that are a little less state-centric and a little less limited in their participation. People have really heeded that call, and a number of forums have cropped up over the past 5 or 10 years to try to do that in a variety of different ways. So that I thought was wonderful to see. And as I say, not something I think I fully understood before I embarked on this project, what a diversity of not just different organizations and processes, but approaches and multi-stakeholder models they had. I think the sort of less hopeful takeaway that I had that I will close with is that the question then became to me, what happens as you kind of develop and percolate these norms through all of these different styles of processes? How do you kind of integrate those different outcomes into a more kind of unified norms building process? And there, I think many of these institutions ran into or are still running into some trouble in figuring out how do you kind of advance some of these ideas, some of these proposals through a larger international community. I think the primary vehicle for doing that, my sense has been, is really trying to feed back into the GGE and the OEWG. And I will say, I think those are both forums that have tried to increase sort of their multi-stakeholder engagement. As there's Chris is looking at me like that's absolutely not true, and he's at the OEWG meetings right now, so he can certainly speak to that. But I also think there's been an enormous amount of frustration with kind of what do we do once we've convened these multi-stakeholder processes and we have some ideas and we have some proposals we think are really promising. How do we kind of try to push those forward and get those adopted and understood by a larger group? And there, I think people still sometimes feel they're kind of running into the same choke points and the same small groups of countries and state-centric models. So that was sort of one of the things that I took away a little bit as an action item, or a thing we need to work on further in this space, is understanding once you've created these forums, once they've developed their recommendations, where do they go from there? So let me stop there and leave time for others.
Thanks, Josephine. Jinhe, may I invite you to speak about your chapter, please?
Okay, thank you. I think Liz, it's very honored to participate in this book, and I think this book is quite professional and high quality, and especially focus on the very internet governance issues. And my chapter is about the Chinese governance on the cybersecurity with the multi-stakeholder. But traditionally, these times always think China advocate the cyber sovereignty. So always we think like no so much multi-stakeholder in Chinese cybersecurity governance actually. But I try to go back to the history, and I find in the early times, actually they have the multi-stakeholder in the Chinese internet governance. So I call that time is the pre-centralization period. It's actually is very quite typically Western multi-stakeholder model. But after the 2014, when the CAC, the cybersecurity, sorry, the Chinese administration of the cyber administration, the cyberspace administration of China is established, and then it come to the next stage. I call that is the post-centralization period, and that time we call it like very government lead model, and I classify the four models of the Chinese internet governance model. I call this the government lead model, private sector lead model, and the technical community lead model, and the hybrid model in my chapter. But today I would like to give some updates on the four models. And as we can see these times, the first, the government lead model, I use the World Internet Conference as the example, but last year the World Internet Conference become to an international organization, but this organization, it seems, is led by the Chinese government. So it's very interesting. It's an international government organization like led by the Chinese government. So when we can see the involving of this model, and the second private sector lead model, I use the Internet Security Conference led by a private company called 360, or Jinhe company is a private internet cybersecurity company. And since this conference is still going on, the Internet Security Conference, but even though this conference invites some international scholar and foreigners scholars come here, but it still looks like a domestic conference. All you can see is an international domestic conference. So this model seems actually is not so really the international one, or even maybe, but it is a more typically multi-stakeholder one, but it maybe is not like multi-stakeholder diplomacy. And the third one, technical community lead model, I use the ITF and ICANN conference in China. We hold the technical conference like 3 times in China. But these years, because the pandemic and other factors, seems it's not easy to hold such a technical conference again in China. But we still try to hold a conference. So as you can see, the third one is more technical lead and more multi-stakeholder one, and it seems it's not easy these days. And the fourth one, the hybrid model, I use the Sino-US cybersecurity dialogue. But as you can see, in fact, it's still led by the government, especially by the foreign affairs department administration. So as I update the 4 models, it seems in the second period, like I call it post-centralization period, a Chinese character like government lead is stronger than before. So I think maybe we can see some papers, like white papers published by the government as like one is the in the 2019 code is the jointly build a community with shared future in cyberspace. So in this it calls a concept document, and it say reform on the global internet governance should further with a multilateral and a multi-party approach with participation of various stakeholders. This is the official words, but it called it multilateral and multi-party. So sometimes we think because this multi-party is the same like a multi-stakeholder in Chinese, but when it transfer into the English, it called it multi-party. So it's something different, but still it's a with various stakeholders. And then it lists like governments and international organization, internet companies, technical community, and social organizations and individual citizens should play their respective roles. So we can see, we can understand that the Chinese government still advocate the multi-stakeholder governance very officially. But when, as you can see again, it's still a white paper issues by the Chinese State Council. It's still called the jointly built a community with a shared future in the cyberspace. It's in 2020, it's last year. So it's still say like China champions multilateral participation, leveraging the role of various parties, including governments, international organizations, internet companies, technology communities, non-governmental organizations, and individuals. It's still the same principle, but as you can see, in Chinese word, it still have the multi-party participation, but in the official English version, it only say multilateral participation without the multi-stakeholder. So I think this is some details on the official attitudes on this thing on the multi-stakeholder governance, but we still think like there's some factors of multi-stakeholder in Chinese governance model on the cybersecurity or even the cyberspace, but it's still in like the establishing the Chinese characteristics. So we're still seeing with the opening and reform, we hope like more multi-stakeholder can inside this policy arena, and maybe, so I think I'm a scholar only. I hope like we can do more research on this and push the more open and multi-stakeholder governance on these things. But we need to say like it's involving and historical development of this Chinese governance model is not only one, it's still on evolving. So I think that is what I want to add and emphasize.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jinhe, and thank you for providing that context. Finally, we have Chris speaking on the long history of US engagement with multi-stakeholder diplomacy.
Yeah, thank you. And thank all of you. And it was a great pleasure to participate in this project and this book. I'd say a couple things more generally. As you mentioned, Arun, I've been a government stakeholder and now a non-government stakeholder. So I've seen both sides of this and how that's interacted or not interacted sometimes. I was also on the Global Commission, which was one of these after I left the government, was one of these multi-stakeholder efforts that I thought was interesting. More generally, I'd say that it's interesting. There's a real antipathy among at least Western countries to new norms, vice actually going with the norms we have and implementing them. And so to the extent that's still a debate, which it is, that's how that's broken down, including with the US. And certainly in the US and in most Western countries, and not just Western countries, there's also an antipathy to pursuing a treaty versus, as you said, or someone said, maybe Joel said, a more incremental process where we're actually taking the norms and running them forward. But my chapter was on the U.S. experience. And the last thing I'd say, just more generally, and I'll have a couple general comments at the end, is has been this disconnect in many ways between the multi-stakeholder environment and the state environment, especially in the First Committee, especially with respect to international security. And as we talk about diplomacy, there's a wide range of issues in diplomacy, everything from internet governance to the First Committee, UN OEWG, GGE process, which is more based on international security issues. But one thing that I thought was particularly interesting is that after the GGE came up with the 11 norms back in 2015, including a norm to protect certs, C-certs, that they're like the ambulances or hospitals on the internet and they should be protected. I remember when I was still in the government giving a speech to the FIRST in Malaysia. So the FIRST is the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. It's all the certs from really all over the world, government certs, non-government certs. And someone wrote, and I was talking about what was happening in the UN, and one of the people in the audience raised their hand and said, well, it'd be great if the UN had a norm to protect certs. And I said, well, we do. They didn't even know about it. The community it was meant to protect had no idea this was going on. So that shows one of the disconnects between this multi-stakeholder, what even states are trying to do to protect the multi-stakeholder community and the multi-stakeholder community even being aware of it. Now, the U.S. experience, as you said, has been a long, in terms of multi-stakeholder involvement, it's really been a long one. I mean, the U.S. is one of the early champions of multi-stakeholder involvement, for instance, in internet governance, in ICANN, particularly in the formation of ICANN. And that was always sort of the, a article of faith, something that was argued to the rest of the world, how important that was for the future of the internet, that just having states run it would not make sense. The U.S. also really promoted multi-stakeholder participation in things like setting standards and cybersecurity, not the technical parts of cybersecurity, recognizing early on that, for instance, businesses were an important stakeholder in this because they own much of the infrastructure. And if governments can do a lot and can do a lot prescriptively, but if they don't have other stakeholders working with them, they don't have a complete solution. So they had a long history of that, but it was a little more uneven, I'd say, and even in cybercrime, because there was a good partnership there. But it was a little more uneven when we talk about international security issues. And I think the rationale for that is that there was a sense that, well, First Committee things, this is arms control issues. This is something states do. Why would you have other stakeholders there? It didn't resonate in the beginning, really anywhere, but including in the U.S. And what we saw was that grow over time, which, first a very, very robust, informal set of meetings, briefings, participation in events, creating events. I detail in the chapter just a myriad of different things, different think tanks, different events that were had where the U.S. was either an active participant or a sponsor. And those were certainly very good, and they were really important. But I think those left a little to be desired on each side. The government didn't get the kind of systemic feedback that they needed on their proposals and policies. And a lot of the multi-stakeholders were like, well, this is not enough for us. We need something more formal. And so, one of the things my chapter traces is how that's evolved, how some other countries like Australia had a more formal system, and how the U.S. can move into this more formal environment. I think we have seen that grow, particularly in the U.S. In the OEWG, for instance, the U.S. has welcomed some other stakeholders on its delegation, which is unique for the U.S., and that's been now for a couple of years. And I think that's significant. I think there's been more formal consultations on issues that the U.S. has done. The U.S. certainly does that, not just in the First Committee, but with respect to the cybercrime negotiations in the ad hoc committee, where they've had a number of inputs with briefings of stakeholders. And I think that more formal system complementing the a robust informal system, which I think has to include, you could continue, have think tanks, have academia involved, makes a lot of sense. But making it more formal, I think, helps build that multi-stakeholder community, both in the US and around the world. Now, with all of that, our chapter was originally written a couple of years ago, as you mentioned, and updated just before it was published. But even since it was updated, there's been a lot that's been going on. I think it's worth noting a couple of those issues, and particularly the challenges there. I know one of the prior speakers, one of the editors, talked about the fact that stakeholders, and this was a challenge for the U.S. too. Look, every stakeholder has their own perspective, right? Their own agenda to some extent. I think it was mentioned that private industry sometimes they have a profit motive. They're trying to promote their particular product, and that's an issue. You don't want to pick one of your children over the others. You don't want to give preference to one industry over another. And there's ways around that by having industry groups consulting more broadly. That's helpful. A big mover in this area in the US and really around the world has been Microsoft. Obviously, Microsoft has its own commercial interests too. But it's been it's created things like the Tech Accord that's helped like galvanize industry in a more broad level. And of course, industry is not monolithic either. It's not just the tech industry, it's broader than that. So there are ways to do that. Because even states have their own interest. Every stakeholder has their own interest. And I think you can go in saying, I know what your interest is. I'm going to take that into account as I get your input. And I think that's important. The challenges I've seen, and this kind of echoes what some of the other folks have said, is even with this, it's become a mantra now, Arun. I mean, I think every time you come to an OEWG meeting or people say multi-stakeholders, so many times you expect a genie to appear and this to, happen. But the actual implementation is far less satisfying. So it's great that people say this is an important thing, and the chairs say it's an important thing, and everyone says it's important. But in reality, it doesn't work quite that well. We have in the OEWG is essentially one, sometimes two countries block a great number of stakeholders because it's a consensus process and any one country can veto, and they have because of geopolitical issues and tensions that are going on. A vast number, like over 40 stakeholders who are including, industry like Microsoft, but also a lot of think tanks and other organizations, which means you don't have their voices there. And so that's not really very satisfying. Even the stakeholders who are accredited, I was representing Chatham House yesterday, for instance. You get to read a 3-minute statement, and that's great. But how much real impact does that have? How much back and forth? What's the kind of way to get that input? It's better in the open-ended working group. I'm sorry, on the ad hoc committee for the cybercrime treaty. There's more accreditation. You can't have one country block people. There's more participation, but even there, a bit more uneven. There's been an impact that's been good, but it can evolve. I call that the bronze standard. You have to really kind of move toward a more gold standard. Geopolitical divisions are causing, I think, real challenges here, and that sometimes has nothing to do with cyber, so that's an issue. Accountability is still a huge issue. And the last thing I'll say is there is something called the Program of Action, which is supposed to build to include other stakeholders. The only problem is we're not sure how it's going to do that yet. So we'll see how that goes, but I think this is an evolving issue. And again, happy to have been part of this group.
Thanks, Chris. And I should also, something that I forgot to mention in the beginning, Josephine, Jinhe, and Chris have contributed chapters, as have a number of other scholars. And I just wanted to sort of just quickly highlight their work in the volume as well. We have Arindrajit Basu, who has written on India. He's also here, so maybe if we have time, we can invite him to speak about his chapter. There's Marina Kaljurand, who has offered her perspective in Estonia. Carlos Afonso Souza and Christian Peron on Brazil, and Andres Herbovich, who is a scholar at risk, that's the name of his fellowship at McGill University currently, who has offered his inputs on Russia and the evolution of multi-stakeholder diplomacy. In the 2 minutes that I have, I'm going to try and sum up the objective of the book chapter, but perhaps with an emphasis on my own chapter, which is on geopolitics, which is in some respects the elephant in the room. And the objective of my chapter was to strip away the normative elements associated with multi-stakeholderism as a model of governance. Of course, it can be in a state's interest to champion it as a normative idea, but to highlight in particular the instrumental reasons why multi-stakeholder governance may be preferred by a number of influential states. And if I were to sort of give a banner headline to my chapter, it would be that there cannot be any hard and fast distinctions between states that are seen or are in conventional policy wisdom or even in scholarship supposed or are seen to be championing multi-stakeholder governance and those that do not. And what I do in the chapter is analyze the evolving positions of Russia, China, France, the United States, and the EU towards multi-stakeholder diplomacy, which throws up some surprising findings. I'm not going to repeat all of them, especially because we've had China and the US covered by esteemed contributors. But what I do is analyze the role of certain key actors within the Russian cybersecurity ecosystem. For example, the National Association on International Information Security, the International Information Security Research Consortium, specific multi-stakeholder groups that have been created within Russia to look at international information security, as the Russians call it, and the history of the Garmisch dialogue that happened between the US, some NATO members, and Russia. So you clearly see a pattern where Russia has been using multi-stakeholder dialogues and its orchestration of non-state actors and non-state associations, where there is a revolving door between those who are part of intelligence agencies, then join the private sector, and so on. But there is very clearly a history, at least, of instrumental use of multi-stakeholder diplomacy by Russia. And I want to very briefly on Russia point out, I refer to the point that Josephine made, where she said she's come in to this debate from the vantage point of multi-stakeholder governance in ICANN and in the internet governance space more broadly. And that is definitely an aspirational idea for countries like Russia, which has made such a big song and dance of its hosting of the 2025 IGF, which I believe at this time of happen is not likely to happen following the invasion of Ukraine. So Russia definitely tried through written statements, through oral declarations to flaunt its multi-stakeholder credentials and say that, look, we've landed the right to the hosting of the 2025 IGF. So that multi-stakeholder model that animated internet governance is still a relevant one for international cybersecurity as well. Very briefly on China and Europe, because that's two states that I want to talk about very quickly. China, I argue that China has a quote-unquote render unto approach to multi-stakeholder governance, in that the Chinese government is comfortable engaging with multi-stakeholder models of governance where it already exists, of course, trying to navigate its interests towards its own alignments, as its long history of engaging with the ICANN policymaking process within and outside the Government Advisory Council shows, the GAC, Government Advisory Committee. And it's happy in areas of high politics, as it were, to engage in multilateral forums and limit the participation of non-state actors. But increasingly, we see the Chinese trying to champion multi-stakeholder models of governance in the development of data standards through what was called the Global Initiative on Data Security. So even the render unto approach of China towards multi-stakeholder governance is evolving over time. And finally, on the EU, the EU's cyber diplomacy toolbox arguably represents the most sophisticated attempt at formalizing the creation of a multi-stakeholder regime on a number of measures, which the EU calls cooperative measures, protective measures, and restrictive measures. You're already seeing some multi-stakeholder involvement in the cooperative CBM kind of measures, as well as protective measures aimed at cybersecurity and cyber hygiene, as it were, but less so on the restrictive measures, which includes potentially, if the EU Council declarations are to be interpreted widely, includes the power to impose sanctions. There, we haven't seen multi-stakeholder involvement, but it's quite likely that we may see, at least in the beginning, through attribution statements, which have been increasingly multi-stakeholder in character, some engagement from the European Union there. So that's the geopolitical angle to all of this. I'm in the short time that we have, perhaps we can open up the discussion to Q&A, and if we have time, also bring in some other chapter contributors. But yeah, and if you are asking a question, feel absolutely free to turn on your camera. We say this all the time, but people tend to be shy. You can also write your questions on the chat. All right. While we are waiting for while we are waiting for the first question, maybe if Arindrajit is still there, yes, maybe I can invite him to speak very briefly on his India chapter.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks for kind of inviting me to be a part of this effort. Uh, really interesting and well put together book. Thanks for the interventions before as well. I'll be very brief about the India chapter. It was, I think, an interesting process because India's contributions to the OEWG have been largely passive acknowledgements of kind of all sides of the debate without really going into the nuances or being a rule shaper. So it was kind of interesting to look at how the multi-stakeholder ecosystem shaped this overall passivity. And what I try to do is empirically evaluate the various stakeholder groups, the private sector, media, civil society, and of course, experts as a separate group, and how they have contributed both to shaping India's stance. So I did that by looking both at public contributions and with a few interviews, including with Arun, who has himself been an expert that has contributed to some of these discussions. And then I tried to kind of evaluate how these stances or lack thereof of all these stakeholder groups contributed to India's overall passivity. And I found that there was some degree of correlation, because if you just take the media, for example, the media often does cover a number of multilateral or global conversations. But in India, I found that there were, between the period of 2017 to 2020, which was the period of the book, chapter, there was under 10 articles written in mainstream newspapers, leading civil society organizations that were very active on, say, discourse on digital rights or trade, were not as active on directly speaking about the first committee conversations. And the private sector as well, while very keen to speak about things such as supply chains and critical infrastructure, never in their public communications linked it to what's happening at the first committee. So basically, the entire ecosystem is passive because everyone seems to be relatively happy with the government taking a passive stance and not actually engaging directly, which is very different from other regimes like, say, digital trade, where all these actors that I mentioned have been far more active, advocating for the government to take specific stances. There's been a very clear push and pull on both sides. Recently, India hosted the G20, again, much more open. The government was much more open to both private sector contribution as experts and also to kind of experts, like independent experts contributing as well, which was not the case or has not been the case with the first committee. And the reason behind that is simply because I think, given the lack of a legally binding outcome that's expected from this, it's possible that the stakes are not clearly identified. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Arindrajit, for that quick brief through to the India chapter.